All right, let's move to our next part, which is a panel discussion, kind of like industry insights about phishing protection. To run this panel, we are pleased to have Shakil, Shakil Aziz, solutions architecture engineer from the Ubico. And Shakil actually has in the Ubico help the organization elevate their security postures by strengthening their digital identities through multi-factor authentication. And he is also the evangelist for passwordless authentication. So that's actually a very important element of the whole phishing protection. So Shakil will be our panel moderator. We will invite Oren and Eric to join the panel as a panel speakers. All right, so I will stop my sharing. Really pass the control to Shakil. Shakil, you can take over from there.
Thanks, Brian. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So I think it was a really good presentation by Oren and Eric. I think this is this is super valuable information for everybody listening, and for those that didn't get an opportunity to listen, hopefully they can catch the recorded session. This is coming straight from the industry experts, people that are in the field, that are very close to some of the topics that we talked about here today, and phishing in particular is as we've seen, the most common, if not the most common problem affecting account takeovers today. So I, I think we've kind of covered a lot of this, and I figured maybe we can get a deeper dive into some of these topics in more detail, and maybe we'll start with Oren, since Eric just finished speaking, give him a little bit of a break. But if we look at
needs that water. Look at that. He's cooling. He's
well, I always have it. I talk all day, so I always have a water bottle beside me. Yeah.
So, I mean, I just wanted to touch on the something that Oren mentioned, and regarding phishing campaigns and the themes behind them, and we see that happening, and I'm going to argue that in a generation, anyway, in my generation, we have never seen an event like a pandemic occur. So the question I had really was about what is the impact that the pandemic has had on something like phishing. We do know that the top two attack vectors today are remote desktop and VPN, right? Because everybody moved to remote workforce, needed to work and communicate, and so we saw a lot of services opening up online when before people were coming into the office. So how does the pandemic kind of shaped phishing?
Well, I would say not at all, really. As Eric mentioned, the fact that phishing, you can call it common, but when something happens is the root cause of something like 90% of the time, 95% of the time, pick your number. It doesn't matter if it's 90 or 95%. That's like all of the time, right?
Yeah. I think those numbers are relevant. 5%.
Yeah, it's like, that's like all the time. But yeah, we like to go, it's common or this, and it hasn't changed, forever. The pandemic, I think has sort of two impacts. One, there are attacks that use that theme because it's topical, right? But when the Super Bowl comes around, there will be Super Bowl phishing. And when the election comes around, there'll be election phishing. And the second thing is that, it changes just the way we work and the kind of like the speed and kind of the blasé around, what it is that we're doing. Certainly, I think it makes it more tricky for end users. Like, look, there was a time when I worked at the National Security Agency, we didn't bring our cell phones into the building. We walked in, like, if you got a JCrew catalog in your NSA, .ic.gov email, like that's pretty unusual, right? It's a lot easier to discern. Now I just switch between tabs and it's like, I don't know what's going on. I can get confused. So it's the human ability to like understand what's going on. But my contention would be that like you don't really want to put the responsibility on the humans at all, right? That they're just not they're never going to be able to be effective at that. And there's no example of humans kind of like being a first line of defense that we really would trust in an issue of such a great national and business conquest. So we can stretch and like try to make the pandemic a thing for it, but it's just another kind of like role in like how attackers respond. Again, like I've been a hacker. I've worked on the most elite hacking team in the world, and the attacks they're boring and they're lazy, and you're just looking for the simplest way in. And when everyone's freaked out and trying to find PPE or trying to figure out if ivermectin is a thing, perhaps it's a message, but it's not like any more advanced. It's
Right.
sub ivermectin for I'm sure when I turn 50 I'll be like ivermectin gets sub for colonoscopy. Like, well, I mean, this isn't really anything from a technical perspective to be harping on.
Yeah, I would say the pandemic, as you say, it did modify how attackers are attacking and things like that. But we did learn as security business a couple of things. Before I was specialized in security at Microsoft, I sold Office 365 at Microsoft, which at the time we didn't have enough business in just security, just a thing. So it was both, right? I always say that the pandemic did more for digital transformation in enterprises than we did for 5 years trying to talk to people about it. And really, because people were trying to digitally transform so fast, uh, a lot of organizations put security on the back or trying to get the workload and things up and running. And I think a lot of organizations really learned that when you're designing things, you really have to put security at the start of every conversation if you want to be successful, right? Because there was a lot of organizations I worked with that they were just trying to get work from home going and then left a lot of doors open for threat actors to get into because the security was the second thought.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, it's an amazing thing that like folks who are going to go on a 3 year like zero trust like strategy with, and like figure out something like the pandemic, it like can happen overnight, and it just shows me that the difference between success and failure is action. Okay. And it's possible to take actions. You don't need necessarily large strategies. And that was sort of the point I was trying to make, which is like you can look across your controls and you can say, like, what can I do to be one thing better? And if you're in a constant rhythm of doing that, right, you will find yourself in a very good, end state when it comes to securing your organization. But so many people get mired in the like, what's our 50-year plan? And
Yeah.
the rate of technology is such that like that never works. And the pandemic really showed us like you can move fast, right? Like you can do these things, you can deploy, right? And that's the best lesson is we can move quickly and we can have a better outcome. We just need to take actions.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with all of that. I mean, in my former life, I probably have more in common with Eric. I was a 365 consultant and migrating organizations from on-prem Exchange to Office 365. And it's funny how quickly things moved when the pandemic hit. Teams was something that needed to be rolled out that was going to be a 2 year plan, and all of a sudden everybody's remote, and now you're spinning up Zoom sessions. And so things really moved at lightning speed when the pandemic hit. So I think this is all very, very important information and lessons for us to take into the future in terms of our agility. We can be more agile. We can move more quickly, and I think action is a key word there. So just to switch gears here, I know we talked a lot about the types of phishing attacks, different types of vectors, but we understand that the most prolific type of malicious email in terms of quantities, business email compromise. And interestingly enough, there's a really good article by Microsoft that was written on Beck, I think about 6 months ago, where they had analyzed some of the Beck attacks, and this particular attack targeted about 10,000 organizations in Microsoft 365, and they were leveraging a man-in-the-middle type of attack with Evilgenics or Modlishka, etc. Can you kind of describe a high-level overview of how a typical business email compromise attack works?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as I outlined in my presentation, there's three types of business email compromise attacks. I wouldn't say they're the most common. I would say credential harvesting is the most common form of phishing today. Link-based, is primary. But in a type 1 BEC attacker is just changing the display name. They're spoofing. So it comes from like Tom at AOL and it reads like Bob Iger at Disney.com, right? And this is the common kind of lesson people try to train around, which is like just hover over the things and you'll see the difference. My neighbor is like a deputy assistant attorney general for the United States government, and he was telling me the other day that like he got one of these from the attorney general, and it was like, go get me a gift card. This guy went to Harvard. He's really smart, and he was like about to go do this. Why the U.S. Attorney General would ask him to go get a gift card makes no sense. But that's type 1. That's like this display name. It's about the authenticity. The type 2 BEC attacks are when you have loss of control of an email account within your organization. So someone takes over Orin at cloudflare.com and they start emailing. Well, that's my real account, right? And it's gonna look like it has SPF, has DKIM, has DMARC. You can't hover over it. It's legitimately coming from RP block. It's got all the signals of it. Attackers don't favor the type 2 attacks because they're inauthentic in the sense that like I don't ask people to wire me money. Like it doesn't make a lot of sense. Type 3, type 4 attacks are the supply chain, the partner attacks. And this is when, I say to Eric, like, hey, I'm thinking about buying an E5 license, right? It's like a thing, or I need to upgrade. I need to add another 1,000 users to my thing. So it's like, maybe we've been emailing for years. He's like my rep, like he's a guy, he's got a legit account. But what I don't know is that someone has taken over his account, right? And they're not like actively doing anything until the moment that they want to get what it is they want to get. And that can be data, that can be money, it can be something else. The type 3, the partner, the supply chain attacks, those are the most prevalent, the most damaging. The example I gave in the airline industry, and they're all about that there's an existing trust between parties that know each other, are doing business regularly, and the attacker just kind of getting in there. What's so damaging about them is that the consequences are varied across organizations. A nonprofit in Toronto that loses $10,000 can be totally crippling to them in the way that like the largest bank in the world can handle a $20 million loss. And that's where you see the pain, because being an attacker is a really good business. And if you wake up and you live in some part of the world and you make $10,000 one day, that's like a really great day. And we're too fascinated in our culture with the 20, $100 million, the $1 billion records loss types of the billion, records loss things, the 4.3 trillion, this and that. The real impact is when organizations can't recover. City of Baltimore here, in Maryland, close to where I live, suffered a ransomware. I mean, shut them down, very crippling to them. You see this kind of over and over, and that's kind of the underreported soft belly of this thing, which is like nobody wants to talk about the $5,000, $10,000, $100,000 attacks, and those are going on day after day after day. People are embarrassed to report them, and there's no recovering financially from them.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna mostly echo everything Oren said. I deal with day to day trying to sell my software, so we're evaluating technology. And when we come to business executive compromise, uh, most common way of doing it is spoofing or impersonation. I like to draw the line between the two and make sure people understand there is quite a difference between those two, right? Because in spoofing, it's actually coming from a valid email system, where impersonation, it's really simple to set up a domain name that looks a lot like somebody else's domain name and rely on the fact that somebody's not going to point it out. The most common way they do it is the lures, what is top of mind. During the couple months ago, we saw a lot of the Russian-Ukrainian war, where there were a lot of BECs where people were trying to get you buy Bitcoin to support Ukrainian people, because that was very top of mind for people. And the most damaging, definitely that invoice fraud, where they can very much either through a man-in-the-middle attack or however else they get pretend to be a supplier of yours that you're actually dealing with, get you to pay very, very large bills very quickly.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. That's really important. Good information. I think Oren had mentioned this. We talk about some of these attacks as being sophisticated, and I agree that they're not really very sophisticated. I think what I've seen anyway is the sophistication and is really around how they operate and orchestrate the attack from essentially standing up domains, a few minutes before the actual attack, to the actual orchestration on the targets and how the attack is actually executed. So, what do you guys think about in terms of the evolution of the attack from something that we've seen 5 years ago to something that we see today? And Oren would say, it's largely a lot of this is really the same.
It's entirely the same.
But I'm wondering about more advanced, I came across phishing as a service with something called Evil Proxy, for example, that has made the headlines a couple of weeks ago. Is that are these any more different than what we've been seeing over the last couple of years?
I wouldn't say they're different. I would say that the techniques or the things, the tools, the IP address, the things like that, in today's world are always short-lived, right? In 10 days or so, a IP address is going to be known as a spamming IP address and get blocked. So they're just constantly doing the same setups over and over again in different areas, where that idea of we have a product we've just come out with, just bought, Risk IQ, it was called External Attack Surface Management, we've renamed it, where being able to combine the thought process of understanding the outside world into your world, along with protection from the inside out, is very important, right? Being able to identify when threat actors are starting to stand up infrastructure that is similar to how other threat actors stand up infrastructure, because Oren's right, the way they're doing it hasn't changed. They just shift where they're doing it and the themes that they're using, but they're not all that sophisticated. It's not brand new techniques being invented, right? It's taking advantage of them in just slightly different ways.
Let me tell you what is sophisticated. My grandfather went in for heart surgery and they stuck a needle like up his leg, and like he's like 95 years old. He went home the next day. Like, that's pretty awesome. Like, CRISPR technology is pretty sophisticated, harnessing the power of like the sun and in panels and like powering things, electric vehicles, the thermos, right? Like, you put something hot in it, it stays hot. You put something cold in it, it stays cold. I mean, how does it know, right? That's an old joke, but these are not sophisticated. I mean, and the reason this makes my head explode is because you can't solve the problem if you walk around this thing like, woe is me, I got really duped, and like there was nothing we could have done about it. Now, there are a lot of reasons why corporations play this game around sophisticated and unprecedented, because there's insurance, there's liability, there's lawsuits that come, and unfortunately that's a real concern for organizations when they are an unfortunate victim of an attack. But you know when I meet with folks who have been breached, they always feel like they're being picked on, like someone, carefully went after them. It's not. It's an automated machine. These are really large organizations, and what they are is they're clever, right? And clever and sophisticated and creative are just very different things. And until we kind of get to it and do this basic blocking and tackling, we're just going to see the same results. I mean, that's just the reality of it.
Yeah, I remember reading an article recently about several major technology companies got breached, and you know how the threat actor did it? They put out an ad on Kijiji and all those saying, "Hey, anybody work for these companies? I'll pay you money to install this on your device."
Yeah,
That's not very
this is
sophisticated.
clever. There's a difference between being clever and being
Yep.
sophisticated. And if you go back, a similar example, with the IT help desk, happened in the election when like a 16-year-old in Tampa, Florida, got into Twitter and was able to get access to the President of the United States' personal Twitter account.
Yeah.
Uh, w- I think if you're Twitter and you're saying like AI all the time, and then a punk in Tampa kind of dupes you, you emotionally just can't figure out what it is you want to do about this, right? And so you have to sort of hide behind this. But the reality is that that is not sophisticated. That's unfortunate, embarrassing, maybe a little clever on his part, but we do ourselves a better service by really addressing what the problem is.
Yeah, yeah, and I know I talk about it a lot. Microsoft talks about it a lot. The conversation of always looking for something that's in your environment, always be on the where for it, because it is not complicated to get in, right? To make sure you're looking for the signs of an advanced persistent threat in your environment and being able to react quickly. It's very important things for an organization to think about.
Right, and I think some of the more simpler types of attacks that we've seen quite recently here with regards to, and I'm going to talk about essentially what's known as push bombing or push notification fatigue. Right. So we've seen obviously with securing identities and MFA becoming a top priority for organizations as they move to cloud technologies, et cetera. Enable MFA, and we started off with SMS, and that was good for a while until SIM swapping became a thing, and everybody said, "Oh, let's ditch that and move towards app-based notification, TOTP." And push notification. And now we've seen essentially push bombing, right? If I can essentially get a hold of your credentials in one way or another, maybe phish you in another method, using another method, I can send essentially those notifications and wait for you to click approve. What is your sort of take on that current state is where we see a lot of organizations, a lot of customers now. Everybody has a smartphone. It's easy to basically deploy an app on your phone, and as a corporate method of 2FA, push notification. What do you guys think about that?
I think section factor, whether it's SMS, pigeon signal, Ubico key, whatever, is effective. And again, I would just say like I can go to Black Hat and DEF CON forever, and some really clever guy is going to have some way to SIM swap. But the absence of like doing it is not the goal, right? It's not to say like, oh, I'm sure there's vulnerabilities and everything, and there are clever people, and we fool ourselves to thinking there's not. But what you find is that when you kind of like poo-poo the SMS part of it, and there's certainly like risks with it, it's not the best. I also just don't think it's the most user friendly. You get people who don't do anything, right? And they get like kind of trapped in this, and they kind of like search for it. People should be on an evolution from no MFA to SMS to the app to the key to whatever, to like the lasers, right? Whatever's next.
Yeah.
And like we just need to kind of be like on this moving it forward kind of business instead of like figuring out everything that's wrong with it. I mean, look, at my house, we have like locks and keys. I mean, who is that stopping, right? I mean, I could come up with 100 scenario. Break the window, pick the lock, break the door down. Like, the goal is to create structure, layers, organization, so that you can mitigate damages. I think that's the most important for folks to be doing.
Yeah, that's a great statement. I'm trying to think of what to add to that, my friend. MFA is absolutely fantastic technology, whether it is the tokens or the hard keys, or we always talk about the passwordless and moving towards that aspect, right? It's all great. it's never going to be a silver bullet that's going to ensure that everybody who's trying to get into your environment is only your employees, right? So it's a good start. It's a good thing, but don't let yourself be paralyzed by it.
Yeah, so I'm wondering about low adoption rates, right? I mean, we know MFA has been in the conversation top of mind over the last couple of years. Since I was in the field anyway, and when we started moving customers to cloud platforms such as Microsoft 365, and app-based notification was great. It was an easy way to turn on MFA. But we're still seeing, I think the last number I read with regards to Azure was something like 22% MFA enablement in Azure among administrators. I mean, why are we still seeing such low adoption for MFA?
Well, let me give you like a counterpart to maybe defend the Microsoft folks. So a friend of mine is like I have a friend at Google who shared a statistic with me, which is that like 96% of Google Sheets don't contain a math formula. Okay. And Excel, which is, Google Sheets, like it's a math-based program, right? And I think when you look at these big cloud platforms and you just, we kind of just use these like statistics, right? We're not thinking about the usage, for it. And there are a lot of applications and things that people do on these clouds that aren't sensitive, right? That don't require it. And like it's a tax on them. So I think that, I think Eric would say they'd love to get that to 100%, but I mean, like they're not like hiding behind that part of it. But I don't think it's indicative entirely of the entire story, right? Because it doesn't take into context as to like what are these things that are happening, right? And that's a component of it in my view.
To not to not my own company, which I shouldn't do. I'm still getting paid by them. Have you ever seen our zero trust slide? Have you ever seen one of us present our zero trust slide? It comes off as a lot of times as incredibly complicated. It doesn't need to be complicated, right? There are simple ways of implementing MFA on your technology to get that broad adoption, right? Don't always have to think about you have to make Nirvana right away.
Right. Yeah, and it's certainly not a knock against Microsoft. It's really about customers using the Microsoft platform, and I'm sure it's true of other platforms as well. This is information that Microsoft has provided and do provide regularly in terms of.
Well, I think it's great that they're transparent about it, but
Yes.
there are some scenarios where I think security becomes a tax, and we all live in that. Like, in my smart thermostat at home, I have a 60 character password. Well, unfortunately, in this thing, you got to turn the characters to do this, and it drives my family totally crazy that we do this. So, the question is like, is it really worth it to do that? I mean, I don't know. Like, I'm a person who's going to do it, but I can imagine if you're a farmer or you're a dairy association and you're using Microsoft Azure and you're doing some really interesting things. These are great practices, but like, it's a lot different than the US government, a bank,
Yes.
people protecting much more sensitive information. I think Eric made a really good point towards the end of his presentation. Was like one thing people don't do is they don't kind of take stock of what it is that they're protecting.
Yeah.
Right. And that should inform a lot of the investments that you're going to make. Because I think the first thing really like when I think about is like, well, what is it that I really need to protect, right? Is it social security numbers, payroll, intellectual property? And like, that I think drives adoption, right? Because people are just kind of unaware. One of the first major data breaches I dealt with, it was like a large kind of like ice cream manufacturer. They got breached, and the CEO was saying like, I don't understand. Like we sell burgers and fries and ice cream. Why would anyone want to attack us? And you just felt so like personally hurt because he was so American and this whole kind of like thing. And I said, you're like the third largest credit card processor in the United States. Like that's what they were going after. They just didn't view their business in that way. They viewed themselves as serving ice cream and being fun in the summer. And that's part of building the culture is to show people like, hey, like your business is a little different than maybe you see it.
Yeah, I think the culture is something that I like to talk about a lot, right? I mentioned it in my thing. We do fish education, and make sure you're empathic during this fish education. I talk to some people who are very harsh when it comes down to it, right? Empathic because people will make mistakes, and being empathic to it is going to give you a security advantage for when they do make a mistake. If somebody clicks on them, you want them to inform your security team. If somebody realizes they propped up a VM in Azure and hasn't secured it, you want them to actually go do something about it rather than hide the fact from it because they feel like they're going to be punished.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And based on the last reports I read, Microsoft essentially states that they have really good results with awareness training. Specifically the phishing simulation training and N365 is great, and it's something that I recommend to my customers as well when I speak to them. As long as they have licensing, of course, to be able to do that. Um, that's I think very important.
I know I work for Microsoft, but I like to say the great thing about being a security seller is as long as the customer has the conversation and adopts the technology to help protect against them, we've won.
Right.
Right? I would prefer they buy mine because it really supports my paycheck. But ensuring that they do something about the conversations we have is more important than which product they picked. Right?
Yeah, I mean it's a good point. Now, one of the things that came out of Microsoft Ignite last week were, there were two features really. One was around certificates-based authentication, which is really good for public sector, but something called authentication strengths. And uh, what that allows you to do now is restrict authentication to Azure platform to phish-resistant authentication. So you can essentially now enforce phishing-resistant authentication, and that is FIDO2 security keys, Windows Hello for Business, or certificate-based authentication. I think it's a pretty big step. I think for us as a company, obviously Yubico, we're building products that are built around phishing resistant at the hardware level. Windows Hello for Business is an excellent product as well that does that. That's really a platform authenticator. But we've seen other platforms take this stance as well. Okta, I know, has phishing resistant authentication restriction built into their platform as well.
This is before or after their breach that they installed this?
Well, it was before. I mean, it's an option for their customers to use, right? Whether they're using it internally or not. Obviously, we've seen the octopus and what happened with that. It gets it gets pretty interesting once you learn kind of what they're doing internally. But I think the awareness drawn towards phishing resistant authentication is important, right? Cloudflare, I think, showed this with using security keys and how stop the attack that took down other organizations. And the technology around phishing resistant with FIDO2, I think it's an important sort of milestone, right? I mean, we've seen a lot of authenticators, and I understand. I mean, there's circumvention around every kind of control that you can think of, but I really think that FIDO2 phishing resistant authentication is really going to be the step forward now that we see. I mean, we're seeing that when I talk to customers. We're seeing a lot of interest in it, and it's really a move towards passwordless authentication, right? Removing the password from that auth flow. Obviously, if you're doing something like two-factor authentication, you are still providing a username and a password in that instance. So if it's a phishing site, it's a man-in-the-middle attack. Sure, security keys or phish-resistant authentication checks the URL before it actually proceeds with the authentication. But you're still providing that username, that password over to the attacker. I think with passwordless, you kind of take one step away, or one component away from the attacker, where you don't provide anything. What is your opinion on passwordless technology, FIDO2, phish resistance, and kind of where the industry is moving towards authentication right now?
I've been spending most of my security career on the defensive side of things. I have nowhere near the, hacking background Oren does, but even I can tell you with my basic, certified ethical hacker certification, how quickly I can crack almost any of your passwords, right? So it is the way things are going to move forward to. The complexity of trying to remember those passwords to begin with. I have several senior family members in my life that I am constantly just going and creating new accounts for because they cannot possibly get into their own account. Right? It's just they're clumsy and they're easy from a threat perspective to get around, right? So we have to get beyond those passwords. The 502, as you're saying, is a great step. Password, this is a great step, and I'm sure that 5 years from now we'll be talking about a different technology because it's just an ever-evolving kind of technology.
I think the hard keys are great. I, I think like in our example, it's not the hard keys that are the solution. It's that the attack vectors are multivariate and you need layers, right? And the layers work, right?
Yeah.
Someone I was speaking, a CEO I was speaking to at a large international company was saying like, well, like you kind of missed the first thing. It's like that's not the point. The point is that we're thinking about the scenarios. The phishing attacks require a comprehensive solution, not a silver bullet, right? There's something happened in the SMS in the example. There's something that happened with the passwords. Something happened with the authentication. There's something, right? It goes on and on. And so the success, right, and moving forward is people being comprehensive and having interoperability with all the different layers that they have within their control plane. But I have a lot of concerns about these. There's a consolidation effort that happens, right, when you do this, and it makes some companies or some data stores like the central location for all the identity and all the access, and that's okay. Like it's part of a trade-off, but I think in like some of the examples we're seeing, it's like there's other problems to it. The benefit to the hard keys is they're a great layer, but they're also a great experience, right? And so if you ever had a notebook where you wrote down passwords, or you did what I did, you took dollar bills and you like created schemes around the serial numbers, or whatever it was, when you moved to a password manager and they didn't quite work with your mobile phone, these are great experiences and they make it better and they build a worldwide culture. But we have to be thinking about the comprehensive nature of it because phishing attacks are not always authentication based. Business email compromise has nothing to do with FIDO keys, right? Malware, ransomware have nothing to do with it. These are significant threats in the same space. So I think the thing we want to talk about, the thing we want to implore people on is like, these are great technologies as part of a larger comprehensive solution, right? And that will get us to the best outcome.
Comprehensive solution, not a silver bullet. I'm going to steal that one.
Oh, you're welcome to, yeah.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah, I just said that I think, I think like we're really excited about that blog post we wrote because like we really believe in this kind of zero trust methodology. And we are so thrilled that these hard keys create a better experience and worked exactly like they're supposed to, right? At the
Yes.
moment that we needed them when there were other things that were missing or like weren't working well. But we're sensitive to that it can work in almost the exact opposite way, right? And there's other controls for that, and there's other things that are going on, right? And we always want to keep that comprehensive, multi-layered kind of approach, and really focus a lot on user experience to get the most optimal outcome.
Yeah, I agree. In terms of end user experience, I think certainly, it's end user experience is really what helps adoption in my experience. And now with what we're seeing in the future, what's coming down the pike with pass keys, I'm not sure if you guys have had any experience with those as well at all.
Mhm.
It looks like that's where the industry wants to trend with Apple actually now launching or using FIDO2 in a essentially software-based FIDO2 authenticator, which
Look, if to get on the internet was like getting a driver's license, where you had to bring a social security. Well, you guys aren't in America, right? But I'm assuming
No,
it's the same in
Canadian.
Canada.
Yeah.
But if it was like getting like a government document where you needed like a government ID, a lease, a utility bill, and you were like, I'm this person, a lot of these problems wouldn't exist, right? At the core, a lot of this is about like who's who, who's the identity, and but we don't want that for the World Wide Web. Anonymity and some of these things, like they make it what's so great, but it creates that friction, and there's always going to be a certain number of layers. But if you have to show up at the Internet Bureau with like all your government documents, say like, give me my IP and it's mine, we could go a different direction, but I think that we're not in that world. So
In that same thought, to counteract that, there's still identity theft.
yeah, no, of course,
Yeah,
of course,
you
yeah.
can show, you can have the requirement for all that, and somehow they still find a way, right?
Right, yeah.
Still got to watch out for it.
yeah, I'm just looking at your phishing site there that you mentioned, Eric. I implore everybody to go there and take a look. I hadn't actually come up across this before, but I'm just looking at this common phishing tactics, cunning communication, perception of need, false trust, and emotional manipulation. I think speaks to some of the core themes that you guys were talking about today.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Mhm.
This is really good information here. Okay, well, I mean that's been a great conversation. I don't know if there's anything else.
Are there questions from the?
Any questions from the audience? I know we're a little early. We've got about 20 minutes to go. Covered quite a bit.
Right. So there are some questions, but I don't know if that's question or comments like related to I think related to identity, right? So the way we are need to have like a password or like all kind of things to protect the identity. Is there any way to like, for example, leverage the newer things like a blockchain or things, make rather than you provide your own identity, your identity is kind of on the chain or like an open ID kind of thing. So then maybe that way can solve part of the phishing problems. I don't know if that's something you can comment on.
No, I'll be honest. I cannot, in my current role, comment on a session like this about our roadmaps. Right? Yeah. Is it coming? Maybe. I'm not gonna say yes or no, right? Yeah.
Fair enough.
I
Yeah.
think in general, IT security is an ever evolving solution. So yes, we will always be looking at better ways to be doing things. We will also want to be sure that it's usable. I mean, remember the triangles they always used to talk about? What is it? I can do it well, I can do it fast, and I can do it cheaply. Choose any two, right? So you want to make sure that everything that you're doing is balanced and the industry is ready to implement. You can create something that's absolutely fabulous, but if nobody ever uses it, what good is it, right?
Mhm. Yeah. All right. So yeah, so I think that's an important message. And there's a like what's that called? Gartner like industry trends that curve, right? So when you see where certain technology positioned, For example, recently there's something like Gartner mentioned a security mesh kind of thing, mesh platform. So that's kind of thing. So maybe in the early stage, but maybe coming in the later one. Um, Zero trust is something people mention that because I think some of you also touch on that zero trust things. How does the zero trust really working with the phishing protection then?
Well, zero trust, it's not a product, right? We think of it as like a philosophy, a framework, a state of mind for how to approach it, how to approach, building security. In the old days, like in the 90s, maybe people used the castle moat kind of thing, but then they started, poking out holes to the cloud and, and so forth. And I think what you're looking for is to be comprehensive and to look at controls and how they interplay with one another. So in the example, that I provided, lots of different, products come to bear. You want to protect the user from getting an email in their inbox that they might click on, but not all links come through emails, right? When you click, you might want to remote browser isolate something so that it's not dynamically loading, malicious scripts. Not everything works that way. You might, someone might enter a username and password, but with the, multi-factor authentication, you can prevent it. Or when a user clicks out, you can block, on the web access, gateway side of things. So, it's about putting together, it's about not trusting, at any one point that once you've kind of gotten through the drawbridge that you're there. And a lot of people, we touched on this briefly, are kind of are thinking about this or trying to do strategies around it. My advice to folks is to take action, right? Is to not develop a large, a strategy. It's good to have a plan, certainly, and to be thoughtful, but there's so much low-hanging fruit, some of which we talked about, and every day or every month or every quarter, however you organize your team, you can do one thing, right? That will make yourself better and you'll be better off for it.
Iterative way rather than you just wait up to finish
There's
the
simple things, right?
whole strategy, then think
Look, there are big projects in IT. Like I'm running a bunch of mainframe metal, in my data center to moving to a public cloud. That's a big thing. There are a lot of considerations. There's a lot of requirements, right? Promises that are made to auditors, contractual customers, and so forth. But there's a ton of things in between that folks can make progress on. And we just see the gap between like action and inaction as being effective at solving a lot of the damage. And these damages, they impact us as individuals, the corporations we work for, the corporations we trust, the countries we work in, and generally like civil society.
I think one of the big reasons that where we talk about phishing, I think both Laura and I said about how it's not going away, how it keeps going, how it's easy commodity for a threat actor to use. And one of the reasons is the email and text messages and all those things they use to phish us are designed inherently to receive information from people we don't know. Right?
Yeah,
So that
but this
whole
is a great point.
trust nobody, verify everything. When you're talking to a stranger and you're supposed to talk to strangers, that's the whole point of the technology, right? Like,
yeah, this is one of the
more about mitigating the damage it can do rather than actually saying, no, I'm not going to talk to anybody in the outside world because then, well, how am I doing business if I don't talk to somebody in the outside world, right?
I'm so glad you said this, Eric, because this is like one of the funny things that I've seen over the years when people add that external banner into it.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm always thinking like,
Nuts.
what's the point of the of email is to communicate with the outside world? Like,
I don't know how many times I've said to my customers, if you add external to it, they just start ignoring it because they see it so often. Anything that an end user sees all the time, it's blank, right?
These things, I think that's exactly right. But yeah, I'm always sort of curious about that. It's like, but is it email external? Or people sometimes will say to me like, well, we can't put our email in the cloud. And I think to myself, but where did it come from? It's always come from outside, right? Crossing the internet.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's this like reality to like what's going on in our world that inhibits us from making this progress, and we just have to break it down. It's why we got to stop calling these things sophisticated. We got to stop dividing the problem to ride the trend for 23 and 24 and so forth. We just got to get to it and say, like, look, get on the path, make progress. 90% of the damages come through one thing. It's not like 50, it's not like 60, it's not like, it's not like it's like a plurality, it's not like the most of them. It's like all of them. Okay? If 90% of the ants crawling in my kitchen were coming from the sink, I wouldn't like devise a bunch of strategies to fumigate the whole thing. I'd go nuclear on the sink and dump a bunch of stuff down it. And maybe I'm not smart enough to understand this, but for some reason, and I think it has to do with our desire to not be duped and not feel like we became victims to it. We're just kind of unable to really tackle it. I'm sure if everyone here has seen that World War II airplane thing, right? Are you guys familiar with this image? No. Eric, I was looking at Eric because sorry, but he can't see that. Look at. There's this famous image of like World War II planes with like bullet holes in it, and what they start doing is they start solving the wrong problem. It's like if you can get shot in those places and survive, that's okay.
Yeah,
It's
who cares,
the
right?
planes
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
crashed, right? That like got shot in the other place. That's like more important, and we're missing that forest from the trees component too often.
Wonderful. Thank you for the insights. All right. I think that's pretty much the time we have for the today, and it's actually quite a long session already. And so, but thank you very much to all our speakers, and Oren from Cloudflare, and Eric from Microsoft, and Shaquille from Ubico. And I just want to quickly wrap up the session. And okay, so for people online, so those are our featured speakers for tonight. So they come to share with us their insights and their guidance. I really appreciate. So let's give them a virtual applause. So although we cannot see you, so give them a virtual pat or a virtual applause.